The warm blood on my trembling hands wasn't just Dale's, it was the end of one life and the terrifying birth of another. As I stared down at his motionless body sprawled across the kitchen linoleum on that humid September night in 1974, I felt something crack inside my chest. Not my heart breaking that had shattered months ago under his brutal hands. This was different. This was the sound of a caged animal finally breaking free, even if it meant destroying everything in the process. My fingers still clutching the cast iron skillet that had become my weapon of liberation wouldn't stop shaking. The metallic smell mixed with the lingering scent of the cornbread I'd baked for dinner, creating a grotesque contrast that would haunt my dreams for decades. Dale's pale blue eyes stared at nothing, finally robbed of that predatory gleam that had terrorized me for 6 months of hell. In that moment, standing over my father-in-law's corpse at 11:23 p.m. on September 13th, 1974, I made a decision that would define the next 50 years of my life. I would not let this man destroy me from the grave. I would survive this, and I would make sure my daughter Mariana never knew the terror I had endured. Whatever it took. Good morning, my dear ones. My name is Jacqueline, though everyone here knows me as Grandma Jackie. I'm 73 years old as of March 2025, and today I'm finally telling you the complete truth about a story I've carried in my soul for 5 decades. This isn't just about surviving abuse or domestic violence. This is about what happens when survival requires the ultimate choice, and how a woman can build an extraordinary life from the ashes of an unthinkable act. Before we begin, I want to thank everyone who's found their way to Grandparents' Tales. If this story helps even one person find their strength, please hit that like button and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Knowing my words reach hearts across America fills this old woman with purpose. Now let me take you back to where it all started in the mountains of Kentucky, where a girl named Jacqueline learned both love and limitation. I was born, Jacqueline Marie Hutchinson, on March 15, 1951, in Bell County, Kentucky, where the Appalachian Mountains held our small world like cupped hands. My father Sebastian worked land that had been in our family for 3 generations, growing corn and tobacco that barely kept us fed. My mother Ruby took in laundry and made quilts, her hands always busy, always creating something beautiful from scraps. We were poor in money, but rich in love, 6 children sharing 2 bedrooms, no electricity until 1959, no running water until 1963. I was the second oldest, which meant I became my mother's helper from the time I could reach the stove. By age 8, I could cook a full meal, change a diaper, and keep 4 younger siblings in line while Mama worked. School ended for me on May 18, 1961, when I finished 4th grade. That morning, my father sat me down with the serious expression he reserved for life's harsh truths. Jacqueline. He said, his work-worn hands folded on our scarred kitchen table. Book learning's fine for boys who'll need to make their way in the world, but a girl's education happens in the kitchen and the sewing room. That's what makes a good wife and mother. I nodded obediently, swallowing my disappointment along with my morning biscuit. I loved the stories in our reading books, dreamed of understanding the mysteries in those thick volumes I glimpsed at the county library. But dreams were luxuries we couldn't afford. My childhood smelled of wood smoked bean soup and the earthy richness after summer thunderstorms. We woke to roosters crowing at 5:30 a.m. and went to bed when the kerosene ran low in our lamps. It was simple, predictable, and I knew no other world existed. Everything changed when I got my first period on July 23, 1963, just after my 12th birthday. I woke to blood on my nightgown and was certain I was dying of some terrible disease. When I ran crying to Mama, she handed me a rag and delivered the only education I would receive about womanhood. "Now you're a young lady," she said simply. "You have to be careful around men from now on. Real careful." No explanations about what was happening to my body, no preparation for what lay ahead. I learned the rest in whispered fragments from older girls at church, incomplete words filled with shame and fear. I spent my teenage years believing there was something fundamentally dangerous about being female. At 16, I caught the attention of young men at church socials and the county fair. I had grown tall and lean with dark hair that reached my waist and what my mother called autumn-colored eyes. On August 12, 1967, at the Bell County Fair, I met John Santos. He was 22 from Pineville with sandy brown hair and a smile that made my stomach flutter in ways I didn't understand. "Would the young lady like to dance?" he asked as the bluegrass band played Wildwood Flower on their makeshift stage. That dance changed everything. As John led me around the hay bale dance floor, the world suddenly seemed full of possibilities I'd never imagined. The courtship that followed was everything a 16-year-old girl could dream of: Sunday visits, small gifts, respectful conversation about building a life together. John spoke lovingly of his father Dale, who had raised 3 boys alone after their mother died. "My father never wanted to marry again," John told me with obvious pride. "Said no woman could replace my mother." I met Dale Santos on October 15, 1967, and immediately felt unsettled by his penetrating gaze and invasive questions about my domestic skills. Dale was an imposing man with pale blue eyes that seemed to evaluate me like livestock. His younger sons, Robert and Michael, seemed accustomed to their father's intimidating behavior. But I caught Robert glancing at me strangely several times, not with interest, but with something that looked almost like pity or fear. When John proposed on March 16, 1968, I accepted without hesitation. We wed on January 18, 1969, and moved into a tiny house in Pineville. The early months were challenging John working construction, while I learned to be a wife with monthly visits to Dale that always left me uncomfortable. When I became pregnant in late 1969, Dale began visiting us more frequently. In my 5th month, he arrived with homemade wine, insisting I drink it for the baby's health. The bitter-tasting liquid triggered severe pains and bleeding that night. I lost our son, and only years later would I understand that Dale had deliberately caused the miscarriage. After losing the baby, John began changing, drinking more, staying out late, and eventually becoming violent. The first slap came when I questioned his whereabouts, opening a door to escalating abuse. Dale knew about John's violence and approved of it, making comments about women needing correction. Our daughter, Mariana, was born on October 12, 1972. With her arrival, I discovered protective strength I didn't know I possessed, refusing to allow John to hit me in front of our child. Still, the abuse continued behind closed doors. Everything changed forever on Friday, September the 13th, 1974, when John died in a construction accident. As a 23-year-old widow with no resources, I accepted Dale's offer for Mariana and me to live at his isolated farm. It seemed like salvation, but became my worst nightmare. For the first month, life was peaceful. Then Dale's true nature emerged. The sexual assaults began in December 1974 and continued for 9 months. Dale made his control absolute, threatening to take Mariana if I tried to leave, using his community connections to thwart my escape attempts. The local sheriff even returned me to Dale when I tried boarding a bus to Nashville, accepting Dale's explanation that I was mentally unstable. The breaking point came on September 13, 1975, exactly 1 year after John's death. During a particularly brutal assault, Dale mentioned that John's mother had fought at first, too, revealing that he had abused and likely killed her as well. When my screams woke Mariana, and she appeared in the kitchen doorway, terrified, something inside me exploded with protective rage. In that moment of fury, I grabbed the cast-iron skillet from the stove and struck Dale in the head with all my strength. He fell instantly, blood pooling beneath his motionless body. I knew immediately that he was dead, and I knew I couldn't call the police. No one would believe my word against his reputation. I disposed of his body by feeding it to his hogs, cleaned the kitchen thoroughly, and fled with Mariana to Nashville the next morning. We lived under false identities for nearly a year before I saw my face on a wanted poster and made the decision to turn myself in rather than keep running. The arrest was swift and brutal. I was charged with first-degree murder while Mariana was placed in foster care. During the legal proceedings, John's brothers Robert and Michael fought for custody of Mariana, claiming I was mentally unstable. The breakthrough in my case came during Robert's testimony. Under cross-examination, he broke down and admitted he had known about Dale's history of violence against women, including their mother, but had remained silent to protect the family's financial interests. This revelation shifted public opinion and gave credibility to my claims of self-defense. I was convicted of voluntary manslaughter with extreme mitigating circumstances and sentenced to 6 years in prison. I served 4 years before being released on parole on September 13, 1980. What I'm about to tell you now is the part of my story that truly matters, not the violence that brought me to rock bottom, but how I climbed back up and built something meaningful from the ashes. The morning of September 13, 1980, I walked out of the Tennessee prison for women, carrying a paper bag with my few belongings and wearing the same dress I'd worn to court 4 years earlier. It hung loose on my frame. I'd lost 20 pounds during my incarceration, not from poor food, but from the constant anxiety that ate at my stomach like acid. Sister Conception met me at the prison gates, her weathered face breaking into the same kind smile that had sustained me through the darkest moments of my sentence. At 75, she moved slowly but with purpose, her rosary clicking softly as she walked. "Ready to begin again, child?" she asked, though we both knew the answer was far more complicated than yes or no. The halfway house she'd arranged for me was in a part of Nashville I'd never seen, a neighborhood of narrow shotgun houses and cracked sidewalks, where hope seemed as patchy as the grass in the tiny front yards. St. Mary's Transitional Home sat on Jefferson Street, a converted Victorian mansion that housed 12 women all trying to rebuild their lives after prison. "Rule number 1, said Mrs. Patterson, the house manager, as she showed me to my room on the 2nd floor. "No men visitors. Rule number 2, no alcohol or drugs. Rule number 3, you find work within 2 weeks, or you find somewhere else to live." She handed me a key to a room that was barely larger than my prison cell, furnished with a single bed, a dresser with a cracked mirror, and a window that looked out on an alley where stray cats fought over garbage. I sat on the thin mattress that first night, listening to the sounds of the city sirens, car horns' voices calling out in languages I didn't recognize. After 4 years of prison routine, the chaos of freedom felt overwhelming. In prison, I'd known exactly what to expect every moment of every day. Here, the future stretched ahead like an unmapped territory full of dangers I couldn't predict. The panic attack hit me at 2 a.m. I woke gasping for breath, my heart hammering against my ribs, convinced I was dying. The walls of the tiny room seemed to close in like a fist, and I couldn't remember where I was or why I wasn't in my prison cell. I stumbled to the bathroom down the hall, splashed cold water on my face, and stared at the stranger in the mirror, a 31-year-old woman with premature gray streaks in her hair and eyes that had seen too much. "You're free," I whispered to my reflection. "You're free, and you're going to see Mariana again." But freedom felt more like falling than flying. Finding work with a murder conviction proved nearly impossible. I spent my first week knocking on doors, filling out applications, watching potential employers' expressions change the moment they reached the question about criminal history. The few who agreed to interview me would ask what I'd been convicted of, and when I answered, voluntary manslaughter, the conversation would end abruptly. It was Sister Conception who finally found me work through her network of contacts at local Catholic churches. Sunrise Cleaning Services needed someone for the night shift cleaning downtown office buildings. The pay was minimum wage, $3.10 an hour in 1980, but they were willing to hire someone with my background. "Can you work 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Monday through Friday?" asked Mr. Rodriguez, the supervisor, when I met him at their small office above a tire shop. He was a stocky man with calloused hands and the tired eyes of someone who worked multiple jobs to support his family. "Yes, sir," I replied immediately. I would have worked any hours, any conditions, just to have legitimate employment. My first night on the job was September 25, 1980. Mr. Rodriguez drove me downtown in his battered pickup truck, the city lights blurring past the windows, as he explained my duties. I would be responsible for cleaning 3 floors of the First National Bank building, emptying trash cans, vacuuming carpets, mopping floors, cleaning bathrooms, and dusting every surface that might accumulate the day's dirt. "The key is to be invisible," he told me as we rode the service elevator up to the 15th floor. "These office people, they don't want to see you or think about you. They want to come in Monday morning and find everything perfect like magic happened while they were gone." He handed me a ring of keys, a cart full of cleaning supplies, and a list of tasks that seemed endless. "Take your time tonight," he said. "I'll check on you around 2 a.m. After this week, you'll be on your own." When the elevator doors closed behind him, I stood alone in the corridor of offices, fluorescent lights humming overhead like mechanical insects. The silence was different from prison silence here. It felt expectant, as if the building itself was waiting to judge whether I was worthy of this chance. I started with the executive offices on the top floor, working methodically through each room. The lawyers' offices were the most intimidating: thick carpets, leather-bound books, framed diplomas covering the walls, like certificates of superiority. As I emptied their wastebaskets, I couldn't help reading the fragments of their lives discarded there. Memos about million-dollar deals, lunch receipts from restaurants I'd never be able to afford, personal notes written on expensive stationery. One office belonged to a family law attorney named Rebecca Morrison. Her desk was covered with case files, and I glimpsed enough to realize she handled divorce cases, custody disputes, domestic violence, restraining orders. This woman spent her days helping people escape the kinds of situations I'd lived through. I wondered what she would think of me. Would she see someone who'd made the ultimate escape, or just another criminal who'd let violence corrupt her? By 4 a.m., my back ached from bending over to scrub floors, and my hands were raw from the industrial cleaning chemicals. I took a break in the small employee break room, sitting in the dark and eating the peanut butter sandwich I'd packed for dinner. Through the window, I could see the Cumberland River reflecting the city lights, and for a moment, I allowed myself to feel something approaching peace. The worst part of the job was the bathrooms. Not because they were particularly dirty, office workers were relatively neat, but because every time I knelt on the floor to scrub around the base of a toilet, I was reminded of other times I'd been forced to my knees, other moments when I'd felt powerless and degraded. Dale's ghost seemed to follow me into those small, tiled rooms, whispering that this was all I was good for, all I'd ever be good for. But I pushed through those moments by thinking about Mariana. She was now 8 years old, living with Robert and Carmen in Kentucky, probably forgetting more about me each day. Every dollar I earned cleaning these offices was a step closer to getting her back. Every night I completed without breaking down was proof that I could be the mother she needed. When Mr. Rodriguez returned at 6 a.m., I had finished everything on the list and was mopping the lobby for the second time because I didn't want him to think I wasn't working hard enough. "Good job," he said, checking his watch. "Building looks good. Can you handle this on your own tomorrow night?" "Yes, sir," I said, meaning it. I could handle anything if it meant earning the right to be Mariana's mother again. I took the bus back to the halfway house as the sun rose over Nashville, my body exhausted, but my spirit cautiously hopeful. Other passengers, nurses heading home from hospital shifts, factory workers starting their day, students with backpacks full of dreams, glanced at me with the casual indifference city people show each other. To them, I was just another working person trying to make ends meet. They couldn't see the blood on my hands or the darkness in my past. For 8 hours, I had been invisible in the best possible way. Back at St. Mary's, I climbed the stairs to my small room, set my alarm for 4 p.m., and fell into the dreamless sleep of honest exhaustion. For the first time since my release, I had made it through a complete day without feeling like the world was crushing down on me. This was how I would build my new life, one night shift at a time, one paycheck at a time, one small victory at a time. 6 weeks after my release, Angelica Washington called with news that made my hands shake as I held the phone. "The court has approved supervised visits with Mariana," she said, her voice careful and professional. 1 hour every other Saturday at the Department of Children's Services office in Nashville. I had to sit down on the narrow bed in my halfway house room. After 4 years of separation, I was going to see my daughter again. But the joy was mixed with terror. What if she didn't remember me? What if she was angry? What if I said something wrong, and they decided I wasn't fit to see her at all? The first visit was scheduled for November 8, 1980. I spent the entire week preparing buying new clothes with money I should have saved for rent, practicing conversations in front of my cracked mirror. What do you say to a daughter you haven't seen since she was 4 years old? How do you bridge 4 years of absence in one supervised hour? The Department of Children's Services building was a concrete block structure that looked more like a fortress than a place meant to reunite families. I arrived 30 minutes early, my stomach churning with anxiety, and sat in the waiting room surrounded by other parents who wore the same expression of desperate hope mixed with fear. At exactly 2 p.m., a social worker named Mrs. Henderson called my name. She was a thin woman in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, and eyes that had seen too many broken families to hold much optimism. "Mrs. Santos," she said, checking her clipboard. "Mariana will be here shortly. The visit will take place in room C, and I'll be observing from the corner. Please remember that any inappropriate behavior or discussion of your case will result in immediate termination of the visit." Room C was painted institutional green and furnished with child-sized plastic furniture that seemed designed to make adults feel awkward. There were toys scattered around blocks, dolls coloring books, but they looked worn and sad, like props in a play about happiness rather than actual sources of joy. When the door opened and Mariana walked in, I felt my heart stop beating. She had grown so tall, 8 years old now, with long dark hair like mine, but John's hazel eyes. She wore a blue dress that Carmen had obviously chosen perfectly pressed and coordinated with white socks and patent leather shoes. She looked like she was dressed for church or a school photograph, not a reunion with her mother. But it was her expression that broke my heart. She looked at me with polite uncertainty, the way a well-mannered child looks at a distant relative they're supposed to remember, but don't. There was no recognition in her eyes, no joy or anger or any strong emotion at all. I was a stranger to my own daughter. "Hello, Mariana?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to run to her, sweep her into my arms, cover her face with kisses, but Mrs. Henderson's stern presence in the corner reminded me that every gesture was being evaluated. "Hello," Mariana replied formally, standing just inside the doorway. She glanced at the social worker, who nodded encouragingly. "Would you like to sit down?" I asked, gesturing to the tiny plastic chairs. "We could color together, or play with the blocks, or just talk." Mariana chose a chair across the small table from me, maintaining careful distance. She folded her hands in her lap like she'd been taught, and waited for me to take the lead in this awkward dance of reacquaintance. "You've grown so much," I said, stating the obvious, because I didn't know how to start. "You're beautiful, sweetheart. You look just like," I almost said, "like your daddy." But something stopped me. Did she remember John at all? What had Robert and Carmen told her about her parents? "Uncle Robert says I look like my grandmother," Mariana said carefully. "My daddy's mother. She died before I was born." The mention of John's mother, the woman Dale had abused and possibly killed, sent a chill through me. But I forced myself to smile. "Yes, I remember her. She was very pretty." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of 4 lost years settling between us like a wall. Finally, Mariana spoke again, her voice small and careful. "Are you really my mommy?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I had to grip the edges of the plastic chair to keep from falling over. "Yes, baby, I'm your mommy. I've missed you so much. Uncle Robert said my real mommy went away because she was sick." Mariana continued her 8-year-old logic, trying to make sense of adult complications. "He said you might not get better." I glanced at Mrs. Henderson, whose face remained professionally neutral. How was I supposed to respond to that? How do you explain to an 8-year-old that her uncle lied to justify keeping her away from her mother? I was sick for a while, I said, carefully choosing my words like stepping through a minefield. But I'm better now. That's why I'm here. That's why I want to spend time with you again. Mariana considered this, tilting her head in a gesture so familiar it made my chest ache. She'd done that exact same thing as a toddler when she was thinking hard about something. Will you go away again? She asked. No, sweetheart. I'm never going away again. I promise. It was a promise I wasn't sure I had the right to make, given that my ability to see her depended on court decisions and social worker evaluations. But looking at her serious little face, I meant every word. We spent the remaining 40 minutes coloring in a book about farm animals. Mariana was careful to stay within the lines, her technique precise and controlled. She had learned to be a perfect little girl, quiet, obedient, careful not to cause trouble. I wondered what had happened to the spirited toddler who used to laugh at everything and had no fear of getting dirty. I like to color horses, she said, working on a picture of a pony. Uncle Robert has horses on his farm. Do you like horses? I love them, I replied, though I'd had little experience with horses growing up. Maybe someday we could go see some horses together. That would be nice, she said politely, but without the enthusiasm a child should have for such a prospect. As our hour wound down, I gathered my courage for the question that had been haunting me. Mariana, do you remember when we lived together? When you were little? She paused in her coloring and looked up at me with those serious hazel eyes. A little bit. I remember singing. You used to sing to me at bedtime. My throat closed up entirely. Yes, I had sung to her lullabies my mother had sung to me, made up songs about brave little girls who could do anything. During those horrible months with Dale, singing to her at bedtime had been the only time I felt human. I remember your voice, she said softly, and for the first time during our visit, she sounded like a child instead of a miniature adult. It was pretty. Would you like me to sing to you now? I asked, my voice rough with unshed tears. She nodded, and I began softly humming, Hush, Little Baby, the same song I'd sung to comfort her during thunderstorms and bad dreams. As I hummed, something in her face changed, a flicker of recognition, a softening around her eyes. Time's up, Mrs. Henderson announced from her corner, and the spell was broken. Mariana carefully put her crayons back in the box and stood up, smoothing her dress. Thank you for coloring with me, she said with the same formal politeness she'd maintained throughout the visit. Thank you for spending time with me, sweetheart, I replied. I hope we can do this again soon. She nodded solemnly and walked to Mrs. Henderson, who escorted her out of the room. Mariana didn't look back, but just before the door closed, I heard her humming the melody I'd sung to her. I sat alone in room C for several minutes after they left, surrounded by the scattered crayons and coloring books, crying silently for the little girl who had learned to be so careful, so controlled, so different from the joyful child I remembered. But there had been that moment of recognition when she remembered my voice. That was something to build on. Walking back to the bus stop, I replayed every word of our conversation, every gesture, every expression on her face. It would have to sustain me for 2 weeks until the next visit. But for the first time since my release, I felt like I was truly fighting for something worth winning. My daughter was still in there somewhere beneath the protective shell of perfect behavior. I just had to be patient enough to help her find her way back out. The visits continued every other Saturday, and gradually Mariana began to thaw. By the 4th visit in January 1981, she was calling me Mama again instead of the formal you. By the 6th visit, she was sitting next to me instead of across from me. Small victories, but each one felt monumental. During our 8th visit in April 1981, something shifted fundamentally. Mariana had been telling me about her school friends when she suddenly stopped mid-sentence and looked at me with those serious eyes. Mama, she said carefully. Why did you have to go away? Mrs. Henderson straightened in her corner chair, alert to the sensitive territory we were entering. I had been dreading and preparing for this question for months. Sometimes grown-ups have to go away to get help when they're sick, I said, using language I'd practiced with Angelica. I was very sad and scared for a long time, and I needed doctors to help me feel better. Were you in a hospital? She asked. A special kind of hospital, I replied, which was technically true if you considered prison a place where people were supposed to be rehabilitated. Mariana nodded thoughtfully, then surprised me with her next question. Did you miss me? Every single day. I said, my voice thick with emotion. Every morning when I woke up, I thought about you. Every night before I went to sleep, I wondered if you were happy and safe. I love you more than anything in the whole world. For the first time in 6 months of visits, Mariana smiled. Really smiled. Not just the polite expression she'd been trained to wear. I missed you too, she said quietly. Sometimes I would dream about you singing to me. Would you like me to sing to you now? I asked, and when she nodded eagerly, I sang, You Are My Sunshine, watching her face light up with each familiar verse. By the end of that visit, she hugged me goodbye, a quick, shy embrace, but a real one. I held that hug in my memory during the long nights of cleaning office buildings, drawing strength from the warmth of my daughter's small arms around my neck. In August 1981, nearly a year after my release, Angelica filed a petition for me to regain custody of Mariana. The legal battle that followed was brutal, expensive, and emotionally devastating, but I was determined to see it through. Robert and Carmen Santos had hired their own lawyer, arguing that Mariana had been with them for 7 years, and that disrupting her stable home environment would be harmful to her development. They weren't wrong about the stability they could provide. Robert had built a successful construction business, they owned a large house on several acres, and they could offer Mariana educational and social opportunities I couldn't match. But I was her mother, and I had served my debt to society. That had to count for something. The custody hearing was held on March 15, 1982, my 31st birthday, though I was too nervous to appreciate the irony. I sat at the plaintiff's table next to Angelica, wearing the one good dress I owned, and trying to project confidence I didn't feel. Across the aisle, Robert and Carmen looked prosperous and respectable, flanked by their expensive attorney. The courtroom was small and stuffy, with windows that needed washing, and fluorescent lights that hummed like angry wasps. Judge Margaret Harrison presided, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and a reputation for fairness, though she was known to be protective of children's interests above all else. Robert testified first, describing the stable home environment they'd provided for Mariana. He spoke about her excellent grades, her participation in church activities, her friends in the community. He painted a picture of a happy, well-adjusted child, whose life would be disrupted by returning to a mother with a criminal record and minimal resources. Your Honor, Robert said, his voice earnest and sincere. Mariana has been through enough trauma in her young life. She deserves to stay in the only stable home she's known, with people who can provide for her future. Carmen testified, next, tears in her eyes, as she described how much they loved Mariana, how she was like their own daughter. She talked about helping with homework, attending school plays, the bedtime stories and birthday parties, and Christmas mornings they'd shared. She calls me Mama Carmen, she said, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. Taking her away from the only real family she's known would be cruel. When it was my turn to testify, my hands shook as I placed them on the Bible to be sworn in. Angelica had prepared me thoroughly, but facing the judge who would decide my daughter's future was terrifying. Mrs. Santos, Angelica began gently, please tell the court about your current living situation and employment. I live at St. Mary's Transitional Home, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. I work full-time for Sunrise Cleaning Services cleaning office buildings downtown. I've had the same job for 18 months, and my supervisor will testify that I'm reliable and hardworking. And what are your plans if you regain custody of Mariana? I'm saving money to rent an apartment where we can live together. I've already looked at several places in good school districts. I want to provide her with a stable home and all the love she deserves. Mrs. Santos, the opposing lawyer, said during cross-examination, his tone skeptical. You were convicted of voluntary manslaughter and served 4 years in prison. How can you provide stability for a child when you've demonstrated such violent tendencies? I had prepared for this question, but it still felt like a slap. I made a terrible choice in an impossible situation, I said carefully. I was protecting myself and my daughter from someone who was hurting us. I've served my sentence, I've had counseling, and I've worked hard to rebuild my life. I am not a violent person. I was a desperate mother, trying to keep her child safe. But wouldn't Mariana be safer in a home without someone who has killed another person? Angelica objected before I could answer, but the damage was done. The question hung in the air like poison gas, reminding everyone that I was a killer regardless of the circumstances. The hearing lasted 3 days. Character witnesses testified on my behalf: Sister Conception, my supervisor at the cleaning service, my counselor from prison. Mariana's court-appointed guardian spoke with her privately and reported that while she loved Robert and Carmen, she had expressed a clear desire to live with her real mama. On the final day, Judge Harrison called Mariana to her chambers to speak with her privately. The 10-year-old girl who emerged 45 minutes later looked tired but determined. She walked straight to where I sat and took my hand. "I told the judge I want to live with my mama," she whispered. "I love Uncle Robert and Aunt Carmen, but you're my real family." Judge Harrison returned to the courtroom and delivered her ruling. While the court acknowledges the stability and love that Mr. and Mrs. Santos have provided, the biological bond between mother and child is paramount. Mrs. Jacqueline Santos has served her sentence, demonstrated rehabilitation, and maintained steady employment. Most importantly, the child has clearly expressed her preference to live with her biological mother. Custody is hereby awarded to Mrs. Santos, with visitation rights granted to Mr. and Mrs. Santos. I collapsed into my chair, overwhelmed with relief and gratitude. Angelica squeezed my shoulder, tears in her own eyes. Across the aisle, Carmen was crying quietly while Robert stared at his hands. 2 weeks later, on April 1st, 1982, Mariana came home with me. The apartment I'd found was a 2-bedroom unit in a complex called Riverside Gardens, though there was no river view and the only garden was a small patch of struggling grass between the buildings. But it had clean walls, working appliances, and most importantly, it was ours. I had spent months preparing for this moment, buying furniture from thrift stores, painting the walls, cheerful colors, setting up Mariana's bedroom, with a twin bed covered in a quilt I'd sewn during my lunch breaks at work. I'd hung cheerful curtains and put up posters of horses, remembering her fondness for them during our supervised visits. But when Mariana walked through the door carrying her single suitcase of belongings, the apartment suddenly seemed smaller and shabbier than I'd remembered. After 7 years in Robert and Carmen's spacious house, our new home must have felt like a tiny box. This is your room," I said, opening the door to show her the space I'd worked so hard to make perfect. "You can arrange things however you like." Mariana set her suitcase on the bed and looked around politely. "It's very nice, Mama," she said, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. Everything was different: the smells, the sounds, the size of the rooms. She was trying to be brave, but I could see the tears she was fighting back. "Are you hungry?" I asked, desperate to do something maternal and comforting. "I could make us some dinner." "Yes, ma'am," she replied, and I realized with a pang that she was being as formally polite with me as she would be with any adult stranger. I made spaghetti and meatballs, one of the few dishes I could cook well, while Mariana sat at our small kitchen table doing homework. The domesticity of the scene should have felt natural, but instead, it felt like we were both playing roles we didn't quite know how to perform. "Mama," Mariana said during dinner, "when will I see Uncle Robert and Aunt Carmen again?" "You can visit them whenever you want," I promised. "They love you very much, and I don't want to take that away from you." She nodded solemnly, pushing meatballs around her plate. "Will you be here when I wake up tomorrow?" The question broke my heart. Of course I would be here. Where else would I go? But to a 10-year-old who had been shuffled between homes and told different stories about her mother's absence, my presence couldn't be taken for granted. "I will be here every morning when you wake up," I said firmly, "and every evening when you come home from school. I'm not going anywhere ever again." That first night, I heard her crying softly in her room after I'd tucked her in and said goodnight. I wanted to go to her to comfort her, but I wasn't sure if that would make things better or worse. She was grieving the life she'd left behind, even as she tried to adjust to the life she was gaining. All I could do was give her time and patience and consistent love. The next morning, she emerged from her room dressed and ready for school, her hair perfectly braided and her book bag organized. Carmen had trained her well in self-sufficiency, and I felt a stab of guilt that my 10-year-old daughter was more prepared for the day than I was.
"I'll walk you to the bus stop," I said, grabbing my purse and keys.
"I can go by myself," Mariana replied. "I'm not a baby." "I know you're not," I said gently. "But I'd like to walk with you anyway. Is that okay?" She nodded, and we walked the 3 blocks to the bus stop in comfortable silence. When the yellow school bus rumbled to a stop, Mariana climbed the steps and found a seat by the window. She waved at me as the bus pulled away, and I waved back, fighting tears. I was 31 years old, and I was learning to be a mother to a child I barely knew anymore. Over the following weeks, we developed tentative routines. I would get up early to make breakfast and see Mariana off to school, sleep until mid-afternoon, then be waiting with a snack when she came home. We'd do homework together at the kitchen table, she helping me with math problems for the accounting class I'd started taking at the community college, me helping her with reading comprehension. Evenings were the hardest. After dinner and homework, we'd sit in our small living room and try to figure out how to be comfortable together. Mariana was used to a house full of activity, Robert's children from his first marriage, Carmen's extended family visiting, the constant bustle of a large household. Our quiet apartment must have felt lonely by comparison. One evening in May, about a month after she'd moved in, Mariana was particularly quiet during dinner. She picked at her food and answered my questions with single words. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. "Mariana, are you unhappy here?" I asked directly. "You can tell me the truth. I won't be angry." She looked up at me with those serious hazel eyes so much like John's, but with a gravity no 10-year-old should carry. "I miss them," she said simply. "I love you, Mama, but I miss my old room and my friends and the way Mama Carmen would braid my hair." My first instinct was jealousy, a sharp, ugly feeling that I had to work to suppress. Carmen had had 7 years to perfect mother-daughter routines while I was locked away. Of course, Mariana missed those familiar comforts. "Would you like me to learn to braid your hair the way Mama Carmen did?" I asked.
Mariana's face lit up with the first genuine smile I'd seen in weeks.
"Could you?" I had never been good at fancy hairstyles. My own hair had been simply braided or left loose my entire life. But that weekend, I bought a book about children's hairstyles and practiced on Mariana until I could create the elaborate French braids she was used to. "There!" I said, turning her toward the mirror after my 5th attempt. "How's that?" "Perfect," she said, running her fingers along the neat braid. "It looks just like Mama Carmen's." It was a small victory, but it felt enormous. I was learning that being a mother wasn't about competing with the past, but about building new traditions while honoring the love that already existed in my daughter's life. Other adjustments were harder. Mariana was used to a structured bedtime routine that included prayers, story reading, and elaborate tucking-in rituals. She was accustomed to having her clothes laid out the night before her lunch, packed with specific snacks arranged in a particular order. Carmen had created a world of predictable comfort, and I was struggling to recreate that security in our smaller, simpler life. But gradually, we found our rhythm. Saturday mornings became our special time. We'd walk to the nearby park and feed ducks in the pond while I told her stories about my childhood in Kentucky. Sunday afternoons were for cooking together, teaching her the simple mountain recipes my mother had taught me. Weekday evenings were for homework and quiet conversation, slowly learning each other's preferences and personalities.
The breakthrough came in July, 3 months after our reunion. Mariana had been having nightmares, not about anything specific, just general anxiety dreams that left her crying and disoriented in the middle of the night. This particular night, her sobbing woke me from across the hall.
I knocked softly on her door and found her sitting up in bed, tears streaming down her face. "I had the scary dream again," she whispered. Without thinking, I sat on the edge of her bed and pulled her into my arms. She melted against me, her small body shaking with leftover fear. "Tell me about the dream," I said, stroking her hair. "Everything keeps changing," she said through her tears. "The houses and the people, and I can't find anyone I know. And I keep calling for you, but you can't hear me." My heart broke for this child who had experienced so many upheavals in her short life. No wonder she had anxiety dreams about being lost and abandoned. "You found me," I said softly. "You called for me, and you found me, and I will never stop listening for your voice." "Never." She pulled back to look at me in the dim light from the hallway. "Promise." "I promise. Cross my heart and hope to die." She giggled at the childhood oath, and I realized it was the first time I'd heard her laugh with complete abandon since she'd come home. "Will you stay until I fall asleep?" she asked. "Of course." I lay down next to her in the narrow twin bed, and she curled up against my side like a kitten seeking warmth. As her breathing gradually slowed and deepened, I stared at the ceiling and marveled at the trust she was giving me. This brave little girl, who had been passed between homes and told different stories about her mother's love, was choosing to believe in me despite everything. I fell asleep in her bed that night, and when I woke up in the morning, she was still curled against my side, peaceful and safe. From that night forward, everything was different between us. The formal politeness faded, replaced by genuine affection and growing trust. She started calling me Mama, without the careful pause that had preceded it before. She began telling me about her friends at school, her favorite teachers, her dreams about becoming a nurse when she grew up. And I learned to be the mother she needed, not the perfect mother I thought I should be, but the real, flawed, loving woman who would fight heaven and hell to keep her safe. Despite our growing closeness, I couldn't escape the trauma that had brought me to this point. The nightmares had never really stopped during my years in prison, but they worsened after my release. Most nights, I would wake at 2 or 3 a.m., drenched in sweat, Dale's face hovering behind my closed eyelids like a malevolent spirit. The hypervigilance was exhausting. Every unexpected sound made me jump. Every man who looked at me too long in the grocery store or at Mariana's school events set my heart racing. I installed multiple locks on our apartment door and checked them repeatedly before bed. I chose seats in restaurants based on proximity to exits. I lived like someone who expected attack at any moment, because part of me always did. But I managed to hide most of this from Mariana. During the day, I could function normally working attending parent-teacher conferences, taking her to birthday parties and school events. It was only in the quiet hours when the ghosts came calling that I struggled to maintain the facade of recovery. The crisis came in December 1985, 3.5 years after Mariana had come home. We were hosting Christmas dinner for the first time, a modest celebration with just the two of us. But I wanted to create special memories in our small apartment. Mariana, now 13, and increasingly helpful in the kitchen, was setting the table with the good dishes I'd bought at a thrift store. She was chattering about her friends at school and the Christmas dance they were planning when she accidentally knocked over the wine glass I'd set out for myself. The sound of breaking crystal on our linoleum floor was like a gunshot in my ears. Suddenly, I wasn't in our cheerful kitchen anymore. I was back in Dale's farmhouse, standing over his bleeding body, hearing the skillet clatter to the floor. The metallic smell of blood filled my nostrils, and Dale's voice echoed in my memory. Just like John's mother. She fought at first, too. I found myself crouched in the corner between the refrigerator and the counter, my arms wrapped around my knees, shaking uncontrollably. The rational part of my mind knew I was safe in my own kitchen, but my body was trapped 11 years in the past, reliving the moment that had changed everything. "Mama, Mama, what's wrong?" Mariana's voice seemed to come from very far away, though I could see her kneeling in front of me, her young face tight with fear. I tried to speak to reassure her, but no words came. My throat felt closed, my chest tight with panic that made breathing impossible. All I could see was Dale's pale blue eyes,
All I could hear was the sound of breaking glass that had triggered this descent into hell.
Mama, please talk to me.
Mariana was crying now, her hands reaching toward me, but not quite touching, as if she was afraid I might break further if she made contact. The sound of my daughter's distress finally penetrated the fog of memory. I forced myself to focus on her face, not Dale's ghost, but the real living child who needed her mother to be present and strong. "I'm okay," I managed to whisper, though my voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. "I'm okay, baby. Just give me a minute." But I wasn't okay, and Mariana was old enough to know it. She had seen her mother disappear into some private hell, triggered by nothing more than an accidentally broken glass. How was I supposed to explain that to a 13-year-old?
Are you sick again?
She asked, her voice small and frightened.
Like before, when you had to go away.
The question hit me like cold water. She was asking if I was going to leave her again, if whatever mental illness she'd been told had taken me away before was coming back to steal me from her once more.
"No,"
I said, firmly, forcing myself to stand up on shaking legs.
"No, sweetheart, I'm not going anywhere. Sometimes I just remember bad things that happened a long time ago, and it makes me feel scared for a little while. But I'm not sick, and I'm not leaving you."
She looked at me with those serious hazel eyes that missed nothing.
"What bad things?"
I couldn't tell her the truth that I was remembering the night I killed her grandfather, the sound of his skull cracking the weight of his body as I dragged it to feed to the pigs. She was too young for that burden, and it would remain my secret to carry. Adult things. I said, pulling her into a hug that was as much for my comfort as hers. Things that happened before you were born. Nothing for you to worry about. But even as I held her and cleaned up the broken glass and finished preparing our Christmas dinner, I knew something had to change. I couldn't keep living with this level of barely controlled trauma. Sooner or later, it was going to affect my ability to be the mother Mariana deserved. That night, after she'd gone to bed, I sat at our kitchen table and made a decision that would change both our lives for the better. I was going to get help, real professional help, for the first time in my life. The next morning, I called the number for the mental health clinic that Sister Conception had given me years earlier. It was time to stop just surviving and start actually healing. Dr. Patricia Williams had an office in a converted house near Vanderbilt University, with comfortable chairs and soft lighting that made it feel more like someone's living room than a medical facility. She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with graying brown hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses.
"Tell me what brought you here,"
she said during our first appointment in January 1986, after I'd filled out forms that asked about everything from my childhood to my sleep patterns. I had rehearsed what I would say, but sitting in that comfortable chair with her patient attention focused on me, the careful explanations fell apart. Instead, I found myself telling her everything: Dale's abuse, the killing, the years in prison, the struggle to rebuild my relationship with Mariana, and finally, the panic attack that had terrified my daughter. Dr. Williams listened without judgment, occasionally taking notes, but mostly just giving me space to pour out the poison I'd been carrying alone for so long. "What you experienced with your daughter is called a flashback," she explained when I finished. "It's a common symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder. Your brain is trying to process trauma that was too overwhelming to deal with at the time it happened."
"Am I going crazy?"
I asked, voicing the fear that had haunted me since that day in the kitchen.
"You're not crazy,"
she said firmly. "You're a survivor who's been carrying a tremendous burden alone for years. The fact that you're here seeking help shows incredible strength." She explained how trauma affects the brain, how memories can be triggered by seemingly innocent things, sounds, smells, even emotions that remind us of past danger. She taught me breathing exercises to manage panic attacks and helped me understand that my hypervigilance and sleep problems weren't character flaws, but natural responses to surviving life-threatening situations. The goal isn't to forget what happened. she told me during one of our weekly sessions. It's to learn to carry those memories without being controlled by them.
The work was harder than I'd expected. Each session required me to revisit the darkest moments of my life, to examine them in detail, to feel emotions I'd spent years trying to suppress. There were days when I left her office feeling raw and exposed, like I'd been turned inside out. But gradually, I began to understand that the shame I carried wasn't mine to bear. Dale had been the predator, the abuser, the one who had created the situation that led to his death. I had been a desperate mother, trying to survive and protect her child. The killing had been necessary, even if it haunted me.
You made the only choice available to you in that moment, Dr. Williams said during a particularly difficult session in March. A man was sexually assaulting you regularly, threatening to take your child, and had escalated to potentially lethal violence. You defended yourself and your daughter. That's not murder, that's survival.
Hearing those words from a professional, someone trained to understand the complexities of human behavior, began to ease the crushing guilt I'd carried for 12 years. I wasn't a monster who had chosen violence. I was a woman who had been pushed beyond all reasonable limits and had fought back when fighting back was the only option left.
The healing wasn't linear. Some days I felt strong and hopeful, ready to embrace the future. Other days, the old darkness would creep in, and I'd find myself doubting everything: my worthiness as a mother, my right to happiness, my ability to ever be truly free from the past.
But Dr. Williams taught me that healing isn't about eliminating all pain or fear. It's about learning to live with them without being paralyzed. She helped me develop coping strategies for when the memories became overwhelming, ways to ground myself in the present moment when the past tried to drag me under. Your daughter needs to see that it's okay to ask for help, she told me one day. You're modeling for her that strong people don't suffer in silence, they reach out and do the work necessary to heal. That perspective shift changed everything for me. I wasn't weak for needing therapy. I was strong for seeking it. I wasn't broken for having trauma responses. I was human for being affected by inhuman treatment. After 6 months of weekly sessions, the nightmares began to fade. The hypervigilance lessened. I could walk through the world without constantly scanning for threats, could sleep through the night without waking in cold sweats, could hear unexpected sounds without my heart racing. Most importantly, I could be fully present for Mariana without the constant undercurrent of fear and shame that had colored our relationship since my release from prison. By 1987, Mariana and I had found our rhythm as mother and daughter. She was 14, navigating the complexities of high school with the same serious determination she brought to everything else. I had been promoted to supervisor at the cleaning company and was taking business classes at Nashville State Community College 3 nights a week. Our life was simple but rich. We had traditions now: Saturday morning pancakes and park walks, Sunday afternoon cooking lessons, weeknight homework sessions at the kitchen table, where we helped each other with our respective studies. I was working toward an associate degree in business administration, and Mariana was maintaining a 4.0 GPA while volunteering at a local nursing home. I want to help people, she told me when I asked about her career goals. Maybe be a nurse or a social worker, someone who helps families stay together. The irony wasn't lost on me that my daughter, who had been separated from her mother for 7 crucial years, wanted to spend her life keeping families intact. But I was proud of her compassion and her determination to turn her own painful experiences into something positive. One evening in October 1987, as we were reviewing her college preparatory course selections for the next year, Mariana asked a question that stopped me cold. "Mama, why don't you ever date anyone?" I looked up from the course catalog, surprised by the directness of her question. At 36, I suppose it was reasonable for her to wonder why I lived like a nun, never mentioning men or showing interest in romantic relationships. "I'm focused on building our life together," I said carefully, "and finishing school. I don't have time for dating." "But don't you get lonely?" she pressed with the earnest concern of a teenager who was beginning to understand adult emotions. The truth was, that I did get lonely sometimes. There were evenings when I watched other families at her school events, mothers and fathers together, couples who could share the joys and burdens of raising children, and felt the absence of a partner acutely. But the deeper truth was that I didn't trust myself to recognize healthy relationships anymore. Dale had destroyed my ability to distinguish between normal, masculine attention and predatory behavior. Every man who showed interest in me triggered warning bells that I couldn't tell were legitimate caution or trauma-induced paranoia.
Maybe someday, I said, deflecting her question. Right now, you're all the family I need. She smiled and returned to her course selections, but I could tell she wasn't satisfied with my answer. As she grew older and more perceptive, she was beginning to understand that my isolation wasn't entirely by choice. It was another consequence of the violence that had shaped our lives. That night, lying in bed, I allowed myself to imagine what it might be like to trust someone enough to let them into our carefully constructed world. Someone who could share the daily joys of Mariana's achievements, who could help carry the weight of decisions and responsibilities, who could offer comfort during the difficult moments that still occasionally overwhelmed me.
But imagining was as far as I was willing to go. The risk of bringing the wrong person into Mariana's life felt too great. She had already been through enough disruption and loss. Our quiet, stable life was more precious than any romantic relationship could ever be.
I graduated from Nashville State Community College in May 1988 with my Associate of Business Administration degree, walking across the stage in cap and gown while Mariana cheered from the audience. At 37, I was finally completing the education that had been denied to me as a child. The degree opened new doors. I was offered a position as office manager at a small accounting firm downtown, regular daytime hours, better pay and work that challenged my mind instead of just my endurance. For the first time since my release from prison, I felt like I was building a career rather than just surviving from paycheck to paycheck. Mariana graduated from high school in 1990 with a full scholarship to Tennessee State University. The night before she left for college, we sat up late in our living room, both of us struggling with emotions we couldn't quite name. "I'm proud of you," I told her as we shared a late-night cup of tea. "Not just for your grades or your scholarship, but for the kind of person you've become. You're compassionate and strong and determined to make the world better." I couldn't have asked for a more wonderful daughter. She was quiet for a long moment, staring into her teacup. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Mama," she said softly, "I need to tell you something I've never said before." My heart clenched with sudden fear. What secret had she been carrying? What pain had I missed, despite all my efforts to be present and aware? "I remember more about when I was little than I let on," she continued. "I remember Daddy hitting you. I remember being scared and hiding in my room. I remember that last night at Grandpa Dale's house when I heard you screaming, the breath left my body in a rush. All these years I thought I had protected her from the worst of it, that her memories were limited to normal childhood experiences. But she had been carrying these traumatic images all along, processing them in her young mind, without help or explanation. "Sweetheart," I began, but she held up her hand to stop me. "Let me finish," she said, with the same determined expression she'd worn as a small child. I never understood what was happening then, but as I got older, I started to piece things together. I know Daddy hurt you. I know something terrible happened with Grandpa Dale. I know you did something that sent you to prison, and I know it was to protect us." Tears were streaming down both our faces now, but she continued with fierce conviction. "I don't need to know the details. I don't want to carry that burden. But I need you to know that I understand you saved us. Whatever you had to do, you did it because you love me. And I've never not for one single day doubted that love." She reached across the coffee table and took my hands in hers, hands that were no longer a child's, but a young woman's, strong and capable and full of purpose.
"I'm not going to college to get away from you," she said. "I'm going to college to make something of the life you fought so hard to give me. And when I graduate, when I become a nurse and start helping other families, it'll be because you showed me that love is worth fighting for." We held each other and cried together for the little girl who had witnessed too much for the mother who had carried too many secrets for the family that had been broken and rebuilt through sheer determination and love. The next morning, when I drove her to the TSU campus and helped her move into her dormitory, I wasn't just saying goodbye to my teenage daughter. I was watching the emergence of a strong, confident woman who would carry our story forward with dignity and purpose. In 1992, at the age of 41, I experienced something I thought might never happen to me again. I fell in love. His name was David Chen, and he was the CPA who had recently joined the accounting firm where I worked as office manager. He was quiet, methodical, and kind, qualities that appealed to me after years of protecting myself from more aggressive personalities. He was also recently divorced and seemed as wary of romantic entanglements as I was. Our relationship developed, slowly built on shared lunch conversations about books and current events, collaborative work on difficult client accounts, and a mutual appreciation for careful, measured approaches to life. David never pushed for more than I was comfortable giving, never made me feel pressured or rushed. When he finally asked me to dinner after we'd been working together for 8 months, I almost said no out of pure habit. But something about his patient kindness made me take the risk. "I should tell you," I said over coffee after our third date, "I have a complicated past. I was in prison for 4 years and I have a daughter in college. If that's too much for you to handle, I understand." David was quiet for a long moment, considering my words carefully. "Can I ask what you were convicted of?" he said finally. "Voluntary manslaughter. I killed my father-in-law in self-defense during a domestic violence situation." Another long pause. Then, "That must have been terrifying. I'm sorry you went through that." No judgment, no alarm, no immediate backing away. Just compassion for what I'd endured. In that moment, I realized I might have found someone capable of loving not just the woman I was now, but the full story of how I'd become her. We dated for 2 years before he proposed, and even then it was a proposal born of practical considerations as much as romantic ones. "I love you," he said one evening as we walked along the Cumberland River. "I love your strength and your intelligence and the way you've rebuilt your life. I love that you raised a daughter who's going to graduate nursing school with honors. I want to share whatever comes next with you if you'll have me." We married in a small ceremony in 1994 with Mariana as my maid of honor, and David's teenage son from his first marriage as best man. It wasn't a passionate, all-consuming romance like you see in movies. It was something quieter, and perhaps more valuable, a partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and the kind of deep affection that grows stronger over time. David never tried to replace John in my memories or compete with my past. He understood that I came with scars and triggers, that there were still nights when nightmares woke me in cold sweats, that certain sounds or situations could send me spiraling back to places he could never fully understand. But he also brought peace to our home in ways I hadn't expected. His calm presence soothed some of the hypervigilance that still plagued me. His financial stability meant I could quit working nights and focus on completing my bachelor's degree. Most importantly, he loved Mariana like his own daughter and gave her the experience of living in a household where respect and kindness were the norm rather than the exception. Mariana graduated from nursing school in 1994 and married her college boyfriend Marcus a year later. They were both dedicated to careers in healthcare, she as a registered nurse specializing in pediatrics, he as a physician's assistant in family medicine. They shared a passion for helping others and a commitment to building the kind of stable, loving family neither of them had grown up with. When my first grandchild Sarah was born in 1998, I experienced a joy so pure it almost undid me. Holding that perfect, innocent baby in my arms, I was overwhelmed by the realization that Dale's violence had not destroyed our family line. Despite everything we'd endured, love had won. Hope had triumphed. Life had continued. "She looks just like you did at this age," I told Mariana as we watched Sarah sleep in the hospital bassinet. "I hope she inherits your strength," Mariana replied, "but never needs to use it the way you did." The next few years brought more grandchildren, Michael in 2000 and Emma in 2003. I became the grandmother I'd never expected to be, babysitting during date nights, attending school plays and soccer games, teaching them to bake cookies and plant flowers in David's carefully tended garden. But it was during one of those ordinary babysitting evenings that my past came rushing back with devastating force. I was watching 5-year-old Sarah while Mariana and Marcus attended a medical conference. We were having a tea party in the living room when Sarah accidentally knocked over her small plastic cup, sending pretend tea spilling across David's coffee table. The sound of the cup hitting the wooden surface was barely audible, nothing like the crash of breaking glass that had triggered my flashback years earlier. But something about Sarah's startled expression, the way she immediately began apologizing for the tiny accident, transported me back to Dale's kitchen on that final night. Suddenly, I was 24 years old again, standing over a bleeding body, feeling the weight of the skillet in my trembling hands. Dale's voice echoed in my memory, just like John's mother. She fought at first too, but this time the flashback was different. Instead of being paralyzed by terror, I felt a surge of protective rage so intense it made my hands shake. The little girl sitting across from me with worried eyes was the same age Mariana had been when I killed to protect her. The innocence in Sarah's face reminded me why I had been willing to do anything, even murder, to ensure my daughter's safety. "Grandma Jackie, are you okay?" Sarah's small voice brought me back to the present. I looked at her concerned face and realized something profound had shifted inside me. For the first time in 27 years, I felt no shame about what I had done to Dale. I felt no guilt about the violence I had used to stop his violence. I felt only fierce, protective love for the generations of women I had fought to keep safe. "I'm fine, sweetheart," I said, cleaning up the spilled pretend tea with steady hands. "Sometimes Grandma just remembers important things that happened a long time ago." "What kind of important things?" she asked with the innocent curiosity of childhood. "Things about protecting the people we love," I said simply. "Would you like to hear a story about a brave princess who saved herself and her daughter from a terrible dragon?" Sarah nodded eagerly, and I began telling her a fairy tale that was closer to truth than she would ever need to know, a story about a princess who found the strength to fight monsters and the wisdom to build something beautiful from the ashes of her victory. In 2005, at the age of 54, I made a decision that would transform not just my own healing journey, but potentially the lives of countless other women. I joined a support group for domestic violence survivors at the Nashville Women's Center. The first meeting was held in a church basement on a Thursday evening, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, while 12 women sat in folding chairs arranged in a circle. Some were recent escapees from abusive relationships, their faces still marked by bruises and fear. Others, like me, were years or even decades past their trauma, but still struggling with its long-term effects. "Would anyone like to share their story tonight?" asked Janet Morrison, the group facilitator, a survivor herself, who had escaped an abusive marriage with 3 young children 15 years earlier. I listened for weeks before I found the courage to speak. The other women's stories were heartbreakingly familiar. The escalating violence, the isolation from family and friends, the threats that kept them trapped, the impossible choices between staying and facing potentially greater danger. When I finally spoke in my 4th meeting, my voice shook as I told the condensed version of my story. "My name is Jacqueline, and 29 years ago I killed my father-in-law to stop him from sexually assaulting me and to protect my daughter." The room went completely silent. Several women stared at me with expressions ranging from shock to admiration to fear. I had just admitted to something that went far beyond surviving abuse. I had admitted to fighting back with lethal force. "I served 4 years in prison for voluntary manslaughter." I continued, my voice growing steadier. I lost custody of my daughter for 7 years. I've struggled with guilt and nightmares, and the feeling that I'm somehow different from other survivors because of what I did. But I'm here tonight because I finally understand that protecting yourself and your children isn't wrong, even when the protection requires terrible choices. After the meeting, 3 women approached me privately. One was being stalked by an ex-husband who had violated multiple restraining orders. Another was planning to leave but terrified her abuser would follow through on his threats to kill her and take their children. The third was struggling with guilt over fantasies of killing her current abuser. How did you know it was the right thing to do? The third woman asked. How did you live with yourself afterward? I didn't know it was right, I told her honestly. I just knew it was necessary, and I've learned to live with it by understanding that some situations don't offer good choices, only choices between different kinds of survival. That conversation planted a seed that would grow into something much larger than I'd imagined. Janet Morrison pulled me aside after my 6th group meeting and made a suggestion that terrified and excited me in equal measure. Have you ever thought about public speaking? She asked. There's a conference next month for domestic violence service providers, and they're looking for survivor speakers. Your story, especially the legal aspects and the long-term recovery, could be incredibly powerful for the professionals who work with women in crisis. The idea of standing in front of a room full of strangers and telling them about the worst moments of my life made my stomach churn with anxiety. But it also stirred something deeper, a sense that maybe my suffering could serve a purpose beyond my own survival. The conference was held at the Nashville Convention Center in November 2005. I had prepared remarks, but when I stood behind the podium looking out at 200 social workers, police officers, attorneys, and counselors, my carefully planned speech evaporated. Instead, I told them the truth in the simplest terms I could manage. My name is Jacqueline Santos, and 31 years ago I was a 24-year-old widow with a toddler and nowhere to turn for help. When my father-in-law offered us shelter, I thought my prayers had been answered. I didn't know I was walking into a nightmare that would last 9 months and end with me killing him to save our lives. I told them about the failures of the legal system that had left me with no protection, the social worker who had returned me to my abuser when I tried to flee the community that had protected Dale's reputation over my safety. I told them about the impossible choice between enduring continued sexual assault or risking everything to fight back. But I also told them about the aftermath, the prison sentence, the loss of my daughter, the years of rebuilding that had led to healing education, career, success, remarriage, and the joy of watching my daughter become a nurse dedicated to helping others. I'm not here to advocate for violence, I concluded. I'm here to advocate for understanding. When women kill their abusers, they're not criminals, they're mothers and daughters and sisters who were failed by every system that should have protected them. They deserve justice, not judgment. They deserve support, not condemnation. And they deserve the chance to rebuild their lives with dignity and hope. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes, but what mattered more were the conversations afterward. Police officers told me my story would change how they responded to domestic violence calls. Attorneys said they would use my experience to better advocate for clients facing similar situations. Social workers promised to be more vigilant about signs of sexual abuse in extended family situations. Most importantly, several survivors in the audience approached me to say that hearing my story had given them hope that healing was possible, even after making choices they'd thought were unforgivable. That day, I discovered my true calling. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was an advocate with a unique perspective on the intersection of domestic violence, self-defense, and the criminal justice system. Over the next decade, I spoke at conferences, universities, and training sessions across the Southeast. My story became a case study in law schools, a training tool for police departments, and a source of hope for survivors who had used violence to escape abuse. In 2012, the Tennessee Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence presented me with their Survivor Leadership Award, the first time the organization had honored someone who had killed their abuser. The ceremony was held at the state capitol building, with legislators, judges, and service providers from across Tennessee in attendance. Jacqueline Santos represents the courage and resilience of survivors, said Coalition President Linda Hayes during the presentation. Her journey from victim to advocate demonstrates that healing is possible and that survivors have unique insights essential for improving our response to domestic violence. Standing on the steps of the Capitol building, holding that award while news cameras recorded the moment, I thought about the terrified young woman who had crouched in Dale's kitchen 38 years earlier. She could never have imagined that her desperate act of self-defense would eventually be recognized as an act of courage worth celebrating. But the recognition that meant the most came in 2016, when Dr. Rebecca Morrison, the law professor, whose office I had once cleaned as a night janitor, invited me to co-author an academic paper about self-defense in domestic violence cases. Your first-hand experience combined with legal analysis could influence policy and save lives, she told me when she made the proposal. Our paper, When Protection Fails Understanding, Self-Defense in Domestic Violence Cases, was published in the Tennessee Law Review and cited in legal briefs across the country. It examined the legal precedents, analyzed gaps in victim protection, and recommended reforms based on real experiences like mine. Reading my name on the byline of a prestigious law journal, I marveled at the journey from fourth-grade dropout to published academic author. Education had been denied to me as a child, stolen by circumstances beyond my control, as a young woman, but ultimately reclaimed through determination and the support of people who believed in my potential. In 2017, Mariana surprised me with a gift that would provide the final piece of my emotional healing plane tickets to Ireland for a 2-week mother-daughter vacation. "You've spent your entire adult life taking care of everyone else," she said when she presented the tickets on Mother's Day. "It's time someone took care of you." At 66, I had never been outside the United States, never even been on an airplane. The idea of international travel felt both thrilling and terrifying. But Mariana had planned everything meticulously, choosing small bed and breakfasts in rural areas where we could explore the countryside at our own pace. Ireland was everything I had imagined, and more: rolling green hills dotted with ancient stone walls, cozy pubs where traditional music spilled out into cobblestone streets, friendly locals who treated strangers like long-lost relatives. But more than the scenery, it was the uninterrupted time with my daughter that made the trip transformational. For 2 weeks, we had no responsibilities except to each other. We walked through medieval villages and toured ancient castles. We sat by the sea in County Cork and talked for hours about everything and nothing. Most importantly, we had conversations we had never quite managed to have at home, where the routines of daily life always seemed to interrupt the deeper discussions. On our last evening, we were sitting in a pub in the village of Dingle, sharing a bottle of wine and listening to a traditional Irish band, when Mariana asked the question that had been hanging between us for decades. "Mama," she said carefully, "I need to ask you something I've never had the courage to ask before. Do you ever regret what you did to Dale?" I had been dreading this question for 43 years, terrified of what my answer might reveal about the kind of person I really was. But sitting in that warm, friendly pub, thousands of miles from the scene of my crime, I found I could answer with complete honesty. "I regret that it was necessary," I said slowly. "I regret that our legal system failed to protect us. I regret that you lost 7 years with your real mother because of choices I had to make. I regret that violence became the only option left to me." I paused, taking a sip of wine and gathering my thoughts. "But I don't regret saving our lives. I don't regret stopping him from destroying us both. And I don't regret that Dale Santos never had the chance to hurt another woman or child the way he hurt us." Mariana reached across the small table and took my hand in hers, hands that were no longer a child's, but a successful woman's, strong and capable and sure of their purpose. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. Not just for surviving, but for everything you built afterward. For becoming an advocate for helping other women, for showing the world that survivors can be more than their trauma. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the fiddle music and watching other travelers enjoy their evening. Finally, Mariana spoke again. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. "Something I've wanted to say for years, but never found the right moment." My heart clenched with sudden anxiety. What secret had she been keeping? When I was in college, I wrote a research paper about domestic violence and self-defense cases. I read everything I could find about women who had killed their abusers, trying to understand the legal and psychological aspects of what you went through. She took a deep breath before continuing. "What I learned is that most women who kill in domestic violence situations don't survive the aftermath the way you did. Many never get their children back. Many never rebuild their lives or find love again. Many are consumed by guilt and shame and never recover from the trauma." She squeezed my hand tighter. "But you did more than survive, Mama. You thrived. You got me back. You built a career. You found love with David. You became an advocate who's helped countless other women. You turned the worst thing that ever happened to you into a source of strength and service." Tears were streaming down both our faces now, but they were tears of healing rather than pain. "You saved us both that night," she said. "And then you spent the rest of your life proving that the love that motivated that choice was strong enough to build something beautiful." We held each other and cried together in that Irish pub, two women finally free from the shadows of a violent past, finally able to celebrate not just survival, but triumph. We returned from Ireland with a sense of completion I had never experienced before. The last vestiges of shame and guilt had been washed away by my daughter's unconditional acceptance and pride. For the first time in my life, I felt wholly at peace with every choice I had made and every consequence I had faced. In 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, when the world was locked down and people were desperately seeking connection, my granddaughter Sarah suggested I start a YouTube channel to share stories and wisdom with others who might be struggling. "Here, Grandma Jackie," she said during one of our family Zoom calls, "you have so much experience and insight. People need to hear stories like yours, stories about overcoming impossible circumstances and building meaningful lives from the ashes of trauma." At 69, I became a YouTuber. Grandparents' Tales began as a way to stay connected with family during the pandemic, but it quickly grew into something much larger. People from around the world began watching, commenting, and sharing their own stories of survival and resilience. The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from domestic violence survivors, from people dealing with trauma, from anyone who needed to hear that recovery and redemption were possible, no matter how dark their circumstances seemed. "Thank you for showing me I'm not alone," wrote one viewer from California. "Your story gave me the courage to leave my abuser," wrote another from Georgia. "I'm studying to be a social worker because of advocates like you," wrote a college student from Florida. By 2024, the channel had grown to over 800,000 subscribers. More importantly, it had become a community where survivors could share their stories without judgment, where people could find hope in the darkest moments of their lives, and where the message that healing was possible reached anyone who needed to hear it. But the ultimate validation came in late 2024, when the American Bar Association invited me to deliver the keynote address at their annual domestic violence conference in Chicago. Standing before 2,000 legal professionals, I shared my complete story, from that blood-stained kitchen 50 years earlier to the podium where I stood as a respected advocate and educator. 50 years ago, the legal system failed me, I concluded my remarks. Not because individuals were malicious, but because understanding was incomplete. Today, because survivors have found their voices and allies have listened, that system is slowly changing. But the work isn't finished. Every woman still trapped in hell deserves better than I received. Every child witnessing violence needs protection I couldn't access. Every survivor seeking justice requires support I had to fight for. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes, but what mattered more were the commitments made afterward, promises from legislators to strengthen domestic violence laws, pledges from police departments to improve officer training, vows from attorneys to better advocate for survivors who had fought back against their abusers. Today, as I sit here in March 2025 at the age of 74, I can honestly say I have lived not one life, but 3 complete lives. The first was the innocent young woman who grew up poor, but loved, who married young and learned too late about the dangers of trusting the wrong people. That woman died in Dale's kitchen on September 13, 1974. The second was the determined survivor who spent decades rebuilding from nothing, fighting through the legal system to reclaim her daughter, slowly learning to trust herself and others, again building a career and a family and a sense of purpose from the wreckage of trauma. That woman served her purpose and stepped aside when her work was complete. The third is the advocate, grandmother, and storyteller who has found peace in transforming personal pain into public service. This woman knows exactly who she is and what she's capable of. She has faced the worst that life can offer and emerged not just intact, but stronger. When people ask if I regret killing Dale Santos, I give them the same answer I gave my daughter. In that Irish pub, I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret the act itself. Sometimes, when all legal protections have failed and all other options are exhausted, violence becomes the only language that evil understands. But what I'm most proud of isn't the killing, it's everything I built afterward. The relationship I rebuilt with my daughter, the marriage I created with David, the grandchildren who know they are unconditionally loved, the hundreds of women I've helped find their own strength, the legal professionals who now better understand trauma's complexities, the policies that have changed because survivors like me refused to stay silent. Dale thought he had won when he reduced me to a terrified victim cowering in his house. But the real victory belongs to me, not because I killed him, but because I refused to let that killing define the remaining 50 years of my life. I transformed poison into medicine, turned pain into purpose, and proved that even the darkest chapters can lead to the most meaningful endings. My story doesn't end with blood-stained hands or prison sentences or even family reunification. It continues every day I choose to live fully, love completely, and share honestly. It continues in Sarah's confidence that she can overcome any obstacle, in Michael's compassion for others suffering, in Emma's determination to fight injustice wherever she encounters it. Most importantly, it continues in every woman who hears my story and finds the courage to believe in her own strength, who understands that she deserves better than abuse, and who discovers that no matter how hopeless her situation seems, there is always a path forward. To everyone watching Grandparents' Tales, I want you to remember this. You are stronger than you know. You deserve love, respect, and safety. No matter how dark your current circumstances, there is hope for a better tomorrow. It might require more courage than you think you possess, but that courage is there buried deep where no one else can touch it. Sometimes we just need another person's story to remind us of our own power. The blood was on my hands 50 years ago, but what I've built with those same hands since then, the love, the advocacy, the healing, the hope, that's my real legacy. That's the story I choose to be remembered for. Thank you for letting this old woman share her truth with you. If my words have touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to Grandparents' Tales. Share it with someone who might need to hear that they're not alone, that survival is possible, and that even the darkest beginnings can lead to the brightest endings. Until next time, remember you are braver than you believe, stronger than you seem, and more loved than you'll ever know.